This is the Fat Man GM, and we're revisiting Twilight 2000. And this particular installment is Urban Guerilla. Like anything, I'm still working on getting this production software and correct and ready. Hopefully my headset is working because I purchased one here recently for fairly cheap at Walmart. I was surprised. And this particular installment, like I said, is Urban Guerilla, set in the United States, Central Florida. I paid $7. Yeah, think the price. I paid $7 for this thing back in '87. I would have been 2 years out of high school. Design Thomas Mulkley, Lauren K. Wiseman, Barbie Pratt, Jim Mark Kearns, Loretta Oblinger. As you can tell, as this company got bigger, they got more and more people involved in this stuff. Nothing wrong with that. The model takes players to Central Florida, now controlled by New America. Members of the natural aristocrats of the St. Petersburg cell patrol the area around Tampa Bay, plan to use it as a springboard for conquest. Players must join the desperate war as freedom fighters who pit their lives against a powerful state being built. And it talks about, all the details and information that it's contained within. Of course, we got our typical introduction, opening bit of what have you. Get used to this. I like to have it up a little higher, but I don't want to mess with things and I run out of room. Kind of a catch-22 with what I got to deal with. Although we've improved somewhat our situation. There's just only so much you can do with the allotted space allowed. Let's see, what are you? What's in it for you? Character background. Players have been asked to stick their noses into business in New America and enclave in St. Petersburg. For a month between March 1st and April 1st, 2001, the city is the hub of a great wheel of desolation caused by the nuclear strike on MacDill Air Force Base across the bay nearby Tampa. Central Florida is largely a wasteland, and the majority of the state's pre-war population is now dead. Communications with the southern half of the peninsula have all but completely ceased. Now there are reports coming out of St. Petersburg that the New Americans have taken over. The resistance movement is rumored to have risen. Characters have been asked to conduct an investigation of the region, contact the resistance forces, establish regular communications with them if the resistance movement has a chance of success against New Americans. Character background. Depending on the variety, which campaign they take, they may have made it to Norfolk and taken a ship from the vicinity, i.e. going home. Either following along an uneventful travel down in Virginia, returning from their previous adventures, and they had to travel from Florida by way of the Texas Red Star Lone Star, the Arkansas Airlords of the Ozarks, or Pennsylvania's Allegheny Uprising. Finally, for those returning home by the way of Grenada, gateway to Spanish Maid, this represents the character's long-awaited homecoming. The referee will need to determine who or what it is that gives the players the current assignment. Players will not have been allowed to not been able to bring any vehicles along with them. They were born. We've been down that road. You also have to take into consideration if you roll into town in a pair of LAVs or something like that with a bunch of military tack, potentially somebody's going to go, "Who are you? And what are you doing here?" Meanwhile, hand over the vehicles because we need them more than you. This one here is out of the frying pan. Like all other Twilight 2000 adventures, this one is played out as an ongoing dialogue between the referee and the players. The players probe, explore, test and limits their character's world, all the while receiving and reacting to feedback from the referee. The referee provides partial information to the players and reveals the knowledge of the complete situation, and the rebels are the knowledge of the complete situation. This chapter should help the referee fill in some of the framework for a particular corner of the world. That's typical of modules in any game system. I don't care who it is. You have to, as a GM, you have all the information, and that's made the assumption that the players have not taken it upon themselves to purchase the same module you did, and then turn it into, you know, a reading assignment for themselves, and then having a bunch of out of character knowledge. It's is what it is. On the other hand, as I've always said, the modules, just like source books, are intended for as a guide, not necessarily as the end all, the beat all. Excuse me. And that way, you make your adjustments accordingly. So you use the framework and create your own necessarily inroads. So put your own twist on things to make it so your more knowledgeable players are still guessing at what's going on and how this is going to play out. And we have, what are we trying to do here? Basically, the way I understand it, the characters are trying to infiltrate New America in some manner to get as much information on them as possible. And then we'll send this information back to whomever their contact is, or their employer, or what have you. And from there, it's up to the game master, the players, to, the world, I suppose, depending how you want to look at it, to decide just how things have panned out and how we're going to proceed from there. Troy, Carthage, Camelot. New America, St. Petersburg is an acronym of surviving city intact, populated, and functioning. Post-war population of 100,000, running water, its own garbage, burning electrical generation station, heavily rationed, of course. The city is a potential springboard for full recovery of the state. Three events are woven into this adventure. A 16-year-old girl is in love. The personal inadequacies of one man has doomed the would-be grandmother, and the opposition to a repressive society is growing as some of its citizens begin to feel that the price they're being charged for personal comfort and security is too much to bear. Which, that has to be, in my mind, a holdover from the older mindset of what America, in the mind of the individual, is supposed to represent. Because, as we know, in the past 3 years, pretty much everything's gone down the toilet. And the fact that you're living in an enclave with upwards of 100,000 people in a functioning piece of bastion of civilization, giving up a few freedoms to be able to live in safety and security, and having a regular, if not always adequate, food supply, having some limited access to power, electricity, having running water and working sewage and things like this, is luxuries in a world where everybody is literally in survival mode. As we know from Howling Wilderness, the rest of the country, large portions of it are under drought conditions, and people are dying in the tens of thousands on a daily basis just from starvation and the lack of protection. So it's I don't know, an acronym holdout from the old days. I mean, that's no matter how you want to play it. And of course, there is a local resistance working against New America, and they're doing terrorist activities, occasional sabotage, and random seeming attacks, which once again is kind of, I don't know. It is potentially the way things are going to go, because typical of human beings, we tend to always have somebody who wants to rail against whatever the establishment currently is at the time. At Courier, concluding the adventure. At the end of 30 days, the players should be giving attention to reporting their discoveries of New America. The referee need not have the players actually prepare their report. It will be enough that they simply tell the referee that they wish to include what they wish to include in it. Likewise, it is assumed that players can safely deliver their report, and the referee need not be concerned with this minor aspect of the adventure's conclusion. The players will cover all the blueprint document, uncover the agitprop reasoning behind the terrorist bombings, and they're able to give a reasonable summation of the strength and the characters of Van U. Wilkerson's guerrillas, this will be satisfactory. The $800 in gold or work limit will be paid to each surviving character. One or more of the players have gone through the entrance interview. This will be a very useful addition to the report, and an additional 200 will be awarded to those players. It should be obvious the players have some sort of popular uprest in the cards. To give them this report, one or more players may choose to remain in St. Petersburg to help to organize a larger rebellion. The information in this module should be adequate for continuing the campaign of this sort. Players should be able to choose to remain, arrangements, get supplies, etc. It says supplies may be delivered in several different ways, but probably they will be deposited along the coast outside the area of New America influence. Supplies should consist mostly of ammunition, should not exceed $1,000 worth per month. The reason which will be revealed in later modules. These supplies will be stop arriving sometime after the end of April, i.e. further information in Howling Wilderness as both the military government and the civilian government in America starts to really have major issues because of the continuing deterioration of the countries itself. Then we talk about Philip Dedro and her son, additional maps. It's an interesting concept about this particular game, and I've taken use of this in the recent play-by-mail that I'm trying to initiate and get into play. That you can acquire city maps, road maps, Rand McNally maps, AAA maps from real-world sources for any of the areas in the world, more or less, that you want to campaign in, and expand upon the very crude and limited maps that come with the books. It says it right here. Acquire additional maps. Rand McNally Company only publishes a general rule atlas, includes the state of Florida, also makes available individual maps of Florida in various cities. AAA makes the state and street maps available to us, and then there's Google Earth too now. Some libraries, particularly, keep in mind Google Earth didn't exist. Some of you new, younger guys, gals, some of this information we had to get the hard way. You had to actually physically go find this stuff and maybe mail order it. You did not have the luxury of just jumping on the internet like you can now and getting the slew of stuff at your fingertips. Much easier to do that today than then. We talk about the land, part one. Florida is a flat, rolling peninsula. Condition in west central Florida. The fact that MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa and Cape Kennedy got smeared on the Thanksgiving Day massacre is well enough known. The player characters would have to be aware of it. Even if the full extent of the damage has only reached them as rumors, no one may really know the true extent of the damage. But according to this here, Florida, as many other parts of the nation, was hit by a series of select nuclear strikes calculated by the Soviets. That was on Thanksgiving Day. And it's implied in other places in the game and the modules that that was the initial Hail Mary strike that really crippled the country, and a lot of Western allies at that point too. But it is to point out that limited exchanges have continued to occur up until, let's say, 98 or 99, when both sides start running low on tactical nukes, and the only options would be mutual obliteration, which nobody truly wants that. Even though they've used this limited exchange of nukes, they did not flatten every major city in the world. That just as well we could have very well done, which would have given us an entirely different type of game system. Let's see. Most of the major calculation, both sides tests proved to be another miscalculation with a small comfort zone. Over half the members of the world's pre-war population who are now dead, or to the other half, many who wish they were dead. As of for Florida, the Mayport Naval Station in Jacksonville suffered a near miss that landed at sea just offshore, resulting nuclear-induced tidal wave and widespread radioactive seawater contamination were dreadful and deadly. Millions died, both in the wave surge and the legacy of nuclear poisoning. Disease, starvation, and the chaos that followed. Almost simultaneously, 3 more sites were struck: MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Eglin Air Force Base near Pensacola on the Florida Panhandle, and the Satellite Recon Launch Facility at Cape Kennedy. Both the MIRVed warheads at Eglin and a single 1-ton megaton that were burst over MacDill were airbursts designed to do most damage to the widest possible area. Cape Kennedy received the attention of 10 warheads at one total 1 megaton device. Unlike the other strikes, this was a series of pinpoint attacks on the various launch sites themselves, resulting blasts vaporized 9 of the 11 launch pads in a vehicle assembly building. A 5th attack, this one aimed at the Homestead Air Force Base south of Miami, apparently never materialized. The failure might have been due to the intense electromagnetic pulse created by the other Soviet nuclear devices detonated more than 50 miles high in several locations. EMP killed all unshielded electronic power sources, functioning electronic devices over most of the continental United States. This is interesting, though, because in the following module that I'm going to review talks about what happens when you find catches of undamaged electronics. If they were protected, they still function. I said for the Homestead weapon, which is presumed to have landed in the sea while south of Miami while detonating warheads or near hits, however, turned out to be quite devastating enough. At least no one complained about the missing 5th bomb. In less than a minute, the majority of people, the second most populated state of the nation, were plunged into a new dark age, literally and figuratively. Since Florida had no major oil refining or distribution targets, it was not as badly damaged as some other states, but carnage was bad enough. Nevertheless, by 2001, the remaining radiation levels on ground level at all ground zeros have fallen well back within reasonably safe or at least tolerable levels. The heat and blast damage remained. Cape Kennedy strike was intended to destroy the launch facilities with some help from EMP. They achieved this end. No more recon satellites to be launched from Cape Kennedy for some time to come. 2 remaining launch pads were so extensively damaged by blast, heat, and radioactive residue that they are effectively inoperable, as is the shuttle landing strip. Interesting note that shuttles were still flying, right? It was the assumption anyway. At Eglin Air Force Base, the main facilities at Herbert Field were scoured off the map. One MIRV was sub-targeted for a nearby naval air station. 7 more were aimed at Eglin's widely spaced auxiliary airfields. 1 warhead was targeted against the Army Airborne Ranger Camp, also located deep in the swamps of Eglin Air Force Base. There you go, Rob. Your Ranger got out and got into the service before your training facility got obliterated. Ground zero for these. Big deal, blast. See, it just goes to show you guys, it goes great. They took some effort to go into detail just to explain just how nasty this stuff was and just how effective these strikes were. The extent of the damage, civil defense planning, what happened, knocking out all the communications and radio and television supplies. Talks about the fact that across the bay, a 16-foot the airburst over MacDill pushed outward, creating a moving wave of water 10 feet high across the lower Tampa Bay. This man-made tidal wave destroyed a large portion of the Grandy Bridge, damaged portions of the Howard Franklin Bridge, and smashed into the boat basins, jetties, docks, and piers, including a local landmark known as the $1 Million Pier, graceful beach hotels, blah, blah, blah. Flooding was widespread in the lower areas and had immediate permanent effects on the operations in Tampa's International, St. Petersburg, Clearwater, Albert Whitting, and Michael night airports when the water receded and only functioning airships were at Clearwater Executive Airport. Again, interesting to know that the wealthy people had a working airport that they could get away, assuming any of their planes would start, which ideally they wouldn't because the EMP would have fried most of them. Survivors could be grateful for only one thing: the wave damage, as bad as it was not radioactive. The high airburst did fairly extensive blast and thermal damage, but owing to its targeting pattern, fireball never touched the ground. No widespread physical debris was sucked up into the radiant center of the blast to become secondary radioactive fallout. It's something to keep in mind as your player characters are traveling the world where any of these nukes have gone off. The potential from the fallout was not just from the particles in the air, but the blast having knocked tons of radioactive material into the air that's rained back down like, you know, mini bomblets to settle and land all over the place. So you could potentially run across something in the countryside that's highly radioactive and you wouldn't know it until it's too late. Or if you're savvy enough or smart enough or lucky enough to get your hands on a Geiger counter, pay damn attention to them. They talk about how all that works in here. Around the 8,000-foot high core of the detonation fell promptly back into Earth in a fairly tight, localized manner, squarely on the unlucky communities of Gibbonston and Apollo Beach. This fallout pattern of just over 20 miles or so settled over the three major southbound escape routes out of Tampa. The sick and dying from Tampa immediately overwhelmed the medical and sanitation facilities of nearby Sarasota. Efforts to halt the exodus of contaminated people and vehicles south from Tampa had led to the establishment of a temporary 20-acre automobile park off Interstate 75, giving a whole new meaning to the term hot car parks. Haha, funny. Right? The Four Horsemen. Death by land, death by sea, pre-Cumberland, wilderness. It's always those who survived by any number clung to the Tampa Bay region. The interior has become a place of wild things: snakes, gators, Florida panther, once near extinction, deer, black bears, eagles, armadillos. All these are native to Florida, and the creatures have also been found at home. Most species of monkeys and apes can and do exist quite happily in Florida climate. Some natives claim to have seen Bigfoot-like creatures known locally as the swamp ape, skunk ape, various exotic bears, polar grizzly, Kodiak. May be stretching things a bit, but such creatures were in local zoos and could have escaped. Florida also has the peccary in addition to their larger wild pig cousins, domesticated cattle bred for milk meat and now running wild. The bison, which is being crossbred with domestic cattle, produce a hybrid known as a beefalo. The feedlot behind my folks had a few of those things for a number of years. Interesting, strange. Open savannas, grasslands. There's also a couple communities down there where there were winter quarters for the major circuses that crisscross the country, and a lot of those creatures would have escaped too, and I think it refers to that somewhere in here. So it's not impossible to run into an elephant, the odd elephant and tiger, lion. Oh my. Disease is old and new. This is going to be a continuing theme or problem. The destruction of the healthcare system and the medical system that kept a lot of illnesses and these diseases in check through. Well, that's not encouraging. I don't know why that settled off. Let's hope that's not an issue. It was the first time I ever had that happen. And I gotta watch. No, it's still recording, so we will continue on and wonder why. One of the things I have run into is this particular software is that it pushes the limit of the CPU capability on my laptop. So I just don't have the computing power that more powerful units do, and I have to take that into account. considering assisted illnesses and things like that. Without lack of proper medical care and prevention, it's going to become more of a problem. And getting sick, getting your common cold, can lead to some devastating results because you don't have once the medications that have been produced and you can scavenge or trade for have run out, you're on your own. Your body needs to either be able to handle it or not. So I expect to see, you will see a higher mortality rate, which would be expected. So we get into the personality section, talking about your main NPC characters. Now, from a GM's perspective, having beginning to try to learn how to play first edition, and I've had a couple of people, second edition is much more better, and I'm beginning to understand that it is, because they really took a lot of the first edition, got the idea out there, and it's still not a bad system, but it has a lot of flaws, and of course any kind of second edition usually follows up is going to have tried to smooth over those flaws and address them in some situation. We've got lots of information on non-player characters, but what we don't have are stats. We have no idea what their skill sets are. We don't have an idea what their training would be, their education, any of this stuff as pertinent to the player character creation. So unless you're going to go through and try to, as the game master, try to create these things from scratch, you're going to have to ad lib and guess. You're going to have to look between the lines that's here and make some assumptions, because there's no mechanics for it. Now, my understanding that second edition addressed that to some degree by giving the ability to create civilians and non-combatants, but we still, one of those trade-offs for having a rules light kind of game setup, more about the story and less about the mechanics. Well, that's fine unless you got to get into a fight with one of these people. Then what? How do we know how well they shoot a pistol? Can they shoot a pistol? I'm just saying, well, what would they do in a physical confrontation? We don't know. We can only make assumptions, and going by somebody's physical picture is not always conducive either. Because in our life, I've met some people that you would look at them and think, oh, they would be an easy to deal with, take over. It turned out to be that far from the case. You remember one scrawny little nerdy-looking kid in school that one big bully found, much to his detriment. This young man actually had some martial arts training and went nuts when he knocked his glasses off because he was terrified. In the process, stuffed somebody almost twice his size out of a window at a moving bus. I'm just saying, it's a downside to this. When we talk about the characters, the major players, and we get into some of the secondary characters, the organizations, the New American Florida cell. I'm not going to go into great depth on this because this is just a lot of backstory for how the cell works and their information. The Nat Turner Brigade is one of the bad guy, or the resistance organizations to New America. This is this center section, which has always been meant to be removed and hand over to the players, which, like I said, because I'd never played the game myself, never could get anybody interested in playing it, I never took anything out. So in this case, you have the blueprint for operations for New America, especially in this particular region. And this is very good information because it gives you a much better understanding about New America's goals and aims and how they function. Here's a map of West Central Florida, and there's a more closer map showing the damaged areas and areas where the nukes had hit and some of the places. So basically you're kind of out here. This area out here is controlled by the Seminoles, and there's something that's probably needs to be touched on. The Seminole Nation. And here we go. Seminoles are one of the few tribes to successfully resist U.S. government efforts to totally remove the Indians from their eastern seaboard in the 19th century. They're only the ones who did so by fighting the U.S. Army to a complete standstill. No treaty was ever signed with them. The government ignored them for a while and then moved in and built post offices. For decades, the Seminoles were isolated in the southern part of the Florida Peninsula in the Everglades. The tribe's still there as of 2000. They're still there today. During the last half century, something remarkable happened. The Seminoles began exploiting their status as a theoretically independent nation to drive truckloads of money through their own unique loophole in the tax laws. What they and the other Indian tribes did with bingo, tax-free tobacco shops, and later luxury resort hotels gave them a great economic clout. At the same time, the new cohort of younger, more military radical tribal politicians succeeded at the tribal council. So basically, when the quote, the shit hit the fan, the Seminoles are one of those few outfits out there who actually benefit from civilization falling apart, because their civilization doesn't depend heavily on the technologies and things of the world. Meanwhile, they also quite adept to surviving in their environment, and they have for 1,000 years, because this has been their home for long before the Americans, or the British and the Spanish, the Spaniards, and whomever came to lay claim to the New World, so to speak. So in this case, their goal is basically to eliminate anybody that ain't them and take over their territory and keep everybody out of it. And if they're going to live a little bit primitive, they're fine with it. And to achieve that end, they've got a limited understanding with New America, and are trading for weapons and stuff. But both sides basically are aware that the other side are just waiting until the right time to negate this so-called understanding, to eliminate the other side. But right now it's convenient for both sides to let the other ones exist, kind of thing, which is something that could be exploited to some minor degree by the player characters if they're capable of bringing these guys around, or initiating them to rise up and eliminate New America, if they can incite them to go to war, so to speak. Then we got Welcome to New America. Explains how they got there to St. Petersburg, what they were doing, the great goals and things that they've managed to achieve since since America hit the bricks. The fact that their engineers were able to get one of the generators, power stations working at Toy Town, and are working on getting a second one up and running. Apparently, these are pre-existing facilities that burn waste, your trash, and turned it into electricity. Which there's not as many of those running around in the operating in the country as people would expect, in part because of the large amounts of toxic and environmentally unfriendly smoke that they tend to produce, even with their more advanced filtration systems. There was always debates. That's why they were not as heavily caught on, and it's the same argument or different argument as opposed to why more nuclear power plants haven't been built in the United States, and no new ones since the 70s, because after Three Mile Island and a couple other incidents, it became obvious that not good stuff to have. And the French and a few other countries totally depend on nuclear power to some degree. Well, since then, we have pushed the environmental friendly technologies harder than, which always annoyed me back when I was growing up, that we had the means and the will. We had the means, we lacked the will. We could have had solar power and wind generators, wave generators, and so on and so forth in much heavier concentrations today, had we acted on that stuff in the 70s when the first oil crisis struck. And I'm kind of cheesed at my parents and my grandparents' generations because of their lack of will and resolve and drive, and the money that was keeping those technologies suppressed. Well, there you have that. New America's goals. New America's the programs. There's some nasty stuff going on under the scenes. I mean, they put up a friendly face. It's not as bad as the Nazis in World War II and the years leading up to World War II, but there's some similarities going on there, and I don't think I need to go into any great depth on that. You can find that out on your own. I don't need a bunch of politically correct social justice people crying at me, look, this is the way it was in the 80s, and you don't like it. I get it. I think things have improved. I also think things have deteriorated since then, so it's just my opinion. The game is what it is. You want to rewrite the game to make it more politically correct? Knock yourself out, and maybe if you're lucky, you will get a nice Kickstarter program or something to help you do it. They see me underside, helpers and hinderers, reinforcements for New America. Ideally, there's New American enclaves spread across the United States, and a couple of these, a couple of these modules deal with that. Some more so than others. This one is the one that's most exclusively dealing with New America, which gives you the most information. There's a hierarchy of the modules, but it's not clear cut. Certainly, these modules would be played if you better played in certain sequence, and then your players would have pre-knowledge of these organizations. So if they went through a couple of the earlier modules that deal with touching and rubbing up against the New American movement, and then move on to these more detailed ones, you'd already be coming in with it. Your characters already have some foreknowledge. On the other hand, if they start with this particular module and they gain a lot of knowledge, then they're going to become specialists on the subject of New America and their activities, and then perhaps lead them into the other modules where the government or whomever their handlers are, their paymasters are keep directing them towards either assisting New America becoming the new dominant government of the United States or breaking it down. It's a matter of how you want to play it out. Of course, our rumor mill, that's one of the things about this game system I really like, is this possibility for a lot of options. Within these things, these so-called rumors, are potential kernels for additional gameplay within the module. Here, rumor Z, a huge monster has been rampaging up in the corn-growing land beyond the power plant. The referee should make some hideous details. Some nuclear, mutated, whatever. Yeah, okay. Hundreds of guns, machine guns, are being smuggled into the city from Gainesville by terrorists. Could be true. Might not be. Then you got land part 2. This is where we go into more the surrounding communities and gives you a little bit of a bio on each one of them and some of the. Like here, the Bay Pines VA Hospital. War broke out. This 90-acre Veterans Administration Hospital, dormitory park, and the cemetery was crowded with aged veterans from World War II and Korea. Big troubles. It's said to drive out smaller troubles. In this case, the tidal wave of wounded from Europe and Middle East soon swamped the hospital's capacity. PTS ward deserves special notice. The effects of modern fire, blah, blah, blah. Bay Pines have been given an unenviable task of serving as the Eastern Seaboard Receiving Hospital for PTS casualties from Europe, Atlantic, and Middle East war theaters. As speak, Bay Pines was a host to over 9,000 broken young men and women. By 97, war on, only blah, blah. The whole nation began experiencing a little of what these broken Joes had gone through. That nickname, the title that these veterans gave themselves, was taken from the name of a toy many played with as children. The inmates here bear an intense, inverted, loyal sort of pride that brooks no rebuttals. Broken they may be, but they defeated proved to be the one thing they weren't. Was what the human spirit, crushed and mangled as it was, proved to be the cornerstone of main price of trials. So basically, the VAs are holed up here. They're holding on and surviving, and enough so that most of the local bandit groups and marauders and the New American people have learned to leave well enough alone until they're better positioned to actually take these guys on. So, it's an example. Argo, Gulfport, Madeira Beach, MacDill Air Force Base goes into more details. St. Petersburg, Pinellas Park, Sunshine, Skyway, Tampa, Sarasota. And we got the appendix for New America. This is the piece that would have been nice to have in those other modules, because when dealing with New America, we had as I read through some of them, I didn't have a whole lot of information to begin with. I understood the concept of what New America was, and I could pick up some of the nuances from what the bits and pieces that were tossed into the other modules were trying to say, and things like Howling Wilderness does a better job of clarifying things like that. But if they'd had this full-on, appendix, if you will, do not own Airlords of the Ozarks. This finishes the Orthodox New America is provided in order to may be constrained as a heretical variety found So there's some variations between this and the actual operations, but it's good information to have, this page. So there you have it. We have Urban Guerilla for Twilight 2000. And nice little cover art there. Always a good system, an interesting game, and I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I continue to do some. I am getting down to my last handful of Twilight 2000 modules, and once I'm done with them, I think I'm going to go and review my limited collection of Judges Guild stuff, because it is so old. It is so different from the standard Dungeons and Dragons type game systems, or world settings anyway. And from that, after that, I'm still up in arms. I'm really leaning towards reviewing my original Star Trek stuff for Facet, because there's some interesting information, interesting concepts there for a game system that some people enjoy and some people don't. And just thought, till next time, game on.